Okay, everybody, good afternoon. My name is Murray Fraser. I'm a professor in the Bartlett School of Architecture, and I've been asked to chair this lunchtime lecture to be given by Luke Pearson, so I'm delighted to do so. Just a few quick comments about Luke, just to introduce him. Luke was a student at the Bartlett School of Architecture, and during his time there, he won the Royal Institute of British Architects main design prize for an undergraduate student in 2005. And so he was obviously a very talented member of the department. He's since then worked both in practice, but also has been teaching in the School of Architecture, and is now a lecturer in the school, while also running his own design practice. But rather than focusing on so much on the design work he's doing in practice, his lecture today is really going to be another strand of his work, which is essentially based around his doctorate, which he's now taking within the School of Architecture, which is looking at the use of video games and video game technology, computer game technology for architectural design. And so this is not just looking at computer games, video games as a kind of cultural product, but also using how they might be used creatively for architecture and, of course, other forms of design as well. So without further ado, I'll ask Luke to come up and start his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Murray. As Murray says, I'm a lecturer at the Bartlett School of Architecture. I've been teaching at the Bartlett now for 8 years, and so what I'm going to talk about today is some elements from my own research and some elements from the various studios that I run. So I work also in a design practice called UMP with Sandra Ukana, and together we run a research cluster on the Master's Urban Design program at the Bartlett as well. But essentially, today's talk is predicated around a question, which is, should architects now be making video game worlds? So if I can start with a kind of anecdote from my own past, the first ever computer that I was bought by my parents in 1991, which this ages me quite badly, but it contained 2 games, one of which was Lemmings, which was a game originally made by DMA Design. And in this game, you have the little lemmings that are walking through the world and kind of basically walking to their doom. And it's your task as the player to kind of protect them and to use a series of tools to kind of instigate behaviors in the lemmings so that they might, for instance, as you can see up here, they might start to build a bridge that will take them away from falling out of the level. But what's really interesting here, I think, is that a lot of the 2D games from this era and beforehand kind of start to relate to what we would call in architecture the cross-sectional drawing, so a cut through architectural space. And in this case, the game is very much directly about that because you direct your lemmings to actually carve architectural space. And so if we go back 6 years to 1985, Super Mario Brothers, there was recently, a couple of years ago, they released to the public a trove of the original graph paper drawings that the designer Shigeru Miyamoto and his art team actually produced to design these game levels. And so again, we can see there's a kind of a very architectural sense to these drawings that underpins the design of this game world. And then if we think of people like Etienne Louis Boulet, who used the architectural section in the past, I think what really interests me about video games as a technology is the use of computers to potentially speculate about new worlds. So in the past, the cross-section was used by architects to imagine architectures not necessarily to be built, but architectures that would speak about architecture as a spatial design practice in itself. And we can't really talk about speculative architectural design practice without referencing Giambattista Piranesi, the 18th century Italian architect and artist, who produced a series of drawings of these kind of amazing paradoxical architectural worlds. And Piranesi once remarked that if he was asked to design a universe, he was the kind of person that would be mad enough to undertake that challenge. And likewise, in the 20th century, we have works like the American architect and educator Lebbeus Woods, who produced these amazing speculative architectural drawings, which kind of think about how architecture can challenge the forces of nature, of gravity, the forces of humanity and society, and kind of articulates them through drawings. And you also have groups like the 1960s Italian group Super Studio, who built who designed this project, the Continuous Monument, as a kind of critique of globalization through an architectural project. So none of these are video games, but what I think all of these projects did was they spoke about not only what architecture could be in terms of its physical form, but how architecture could kind of renegotiate the ways that we actually lived within our world. And I think video games are potentially a technology which really offers that potential in the future moving forwards. So architecture, like every other facet of our lives, has been really affected by computers and the advances in computation. So if you think about the kind of work that we do at the Bartlett, there's other people who investigate the relationship between kind of industrial machinery and robotics, and how a building might be translated from the design stage into physical fabric, and how that might be kind of that might create interesting feedback loops. Or you can think of like Zaha, this is a render of her Galaxy Soho project in Beijing, the use of parametric simulation to kind of maybe understand the behaviors of a site, to be able to quantify them, to be able to make architecture from that. And then there's emerging technologies like city information modeling, where we can take all the data of a city and put it together into one giant live 3D model. But it kind of begs the question, how do we allow people to engage with this information? Is this information only accessible to experts? And so I would argue that maybe video games will be, in the future, one of those technologies that allows us to engage people with the design of cities, the design of architecture, as a communicative tool. So this is the game, a game from last year called Nier Automata, which takes place in a kind of post-apocalyptic world, and the whole game is kind of predicated on sentient robots and the question of what existence and what it means, what being is. And so this to me is really interesting, because it's a whole game world that deals with narrative and nostalgia, and architecture is a kind of key protagonist in this. But it's using advanced computation. You know, this is made by programmers, but it also meets visual cultures. This is also made by artists as well. And I think the question of like how video game worlds can kind of inform not only our architectural speculations, but speculations on how we can behave in architecture is really interesting. So at this point, it kind of makes me think of a quote by the Australian media theorist Mackenzie Walk, who wrote a really interesting book called Gamer Theory. And he says something, I might be paraphrasing, but video games present worlds, not just worlds to look at, but worlds that we can act on within, or we can act within, but in a way that's determined by the author of that world. So it's kind of interesting, because as architects, we might often use software like Rhinoceros here. And, you know, there's this relationship to architectural drawing, the plan, the elevation. But these programs also lend themselves quite easily to being integrated with game engine technology. So the type of software that games are built on, like Unity 3D and Unreal. But I think maybe we can't just see games as purely like narrative worlds. We can also question how games structurally change the way that we might approach architectural design. So Minecraft is obviously, you know, one of the most clear references, and I'm sure most of you have probably at least encountered Minecraft in some capacity. But there's obviously been a lot written about it architecturally. What I find really interesting about Minecraft is, if you look beyond all the really interesting stuff being done in terms of like community engagement and Minecraft as a tool that allows people to build things without necessarily having expert training in the software that you might need for something like Rhino, thinking about it in terms of what it means for architecture, all of the projects that I just showed before were architectural projects made through drawing. And now Minecraft kind of returns us to almost these pre-Renaissance days where the architect would be on site directing the building from the ground up. And so the kind of avatar in Minecraft is responsible for doing that. But then we see projects that, for instance, connect Minecraft into 3D printing technologies, allowing you to build stuff directly in the game and then transport it out. But architects have also already engaged with games before. This is a game from 2001 called Oni, where architects were commissioned to design the buildings within the game. And a 2016 game called The Witness that architects were also commissioned as part of this. And then we have architects like Jose Sanchez, who teaches at USC in California, who's actually made a video game called Blockhood, which is about the kind of I guess the sort of ecology of cities and how they kind of grow and what systems are kind of put in place when you start to build urban infrastructure. So I think what's really interesting to me is how these video game spaces deviate from reality. So I was going to kind of ask a quick poll of which image people think is real and which one's from a video game. So maybe if you think the left-hand image is the real one, you could raise your hand and I can see who thinks this is the real one. So we've got a few people here. Okay, so the left-hand image is a screenshot by a screenshot artist called Duncan Harris of Grand Theft Auto 4, which is a game set in New York. And the right-hand image is a piece of architecture by a Spanish architect called Ricardo Bofill. And then for the next image, who thinks the one on the right-hand side is the real one? Okay, so the one on the right-hand side is another screenshot of the game Mirror's Edge, and the left-hand side is the Cube House by Pete Blom. But I guess I'm kind of sort of posing this because we can see that architects also start to put, are physicalizing some of the kind of weird types of space that we might find in video games. Maybe this one's a little bit clearer, but who thinks the one on the left-hand side is the real photograph? No one. Okay. So this one is a screenshot from Deus Ex. Is it? No, it's not. Mankind Divided. Thank you very much. Stinky Human Revolution. Yeah. So to me, this kind of references back to like the Kowloon walled city in Hong Kong and these kind of pure massive urbanism versus the Galaxy Soho again in China, which is kind of more representative of modern Chinese economics. But I guess to get onto some of my own research, so I've looked a lot into the Grand Theft Auto games. This is the city of Los Santos, which is the kind of digital version of LA in the game Grand Theft Auto 5. And if we, for instance, start with kind of cartographic methods, we like overlay the map of the two cities together, we see that the Los Santos as a city is actually really tiny compared to Los Angeles. And this is because the game developers understood that in order to create the feeling of Los Angeles, you don't necessarily need to make a one-to-one geographical representation of Los Angeles, because actually that's not necessarily the way that we experience cities. And so in my work, I've been looking at kind of unpicking this further to look at, for instance, if you know the Grand Theft Auto games, they're basically predicated on crime. So the city has a vast amount of police stations and hospitals, given the size of the city. So to look at the kind of infrastructure that's within this city and how that might communicate to the player a rather different message than we feel from this sort of selfish city where everyone performs crimes. There's actually quite a lot of infrastructure there, publicly funded infrastructure, as it were, given the size of this virtual city. And then I kind of look at the mechanics of games. So in Grand Theft Auto, you can switch between 3 different protagonists. And when you do that, it kind of flies you across the world. So I'm kind of really interested by how, for the player, this makes a form of architectural space within a space. So you have the kind of virtual city, but then you have how the mechanics of that virtual city create sort of subspaces within it. And so part of my research has been to make, as an architect, to make drawings and models of these spaces to try and articulate what kind of, I guess, architectural happenings are taking place within this world. And this extends up into bigger drawings where they're kind of almost half propositional, half mapping drawings of to examine this video game world as essentially a sequence of systems and how that might kind of operate. And then I do other things like returning to the idea of screenshots to take screenshot books. So these are kind of a series of books which are a tribute to the American artist Ed Ruscha, who did very famous photographic books of Los Angeles. And so I make books like this one called Cars on Hills, where essentially this one I think is quite fun because you have these kind of supercars halfway up these hills. And so you get these amazingly realistic looking shots, which, could look like Los Angeles. But then you see this slight little twist, which betrays the fact that it's a game world that has a set of physics which are quite cartoonish compared to reality. And I find that kind of disjunction between the real and the gamey, as it were, to be really fascinating. And so in my own design practice, UMP with Sanju Yukana, we've done projects that look at how we might kind of explore architecture that's like an emanation from game worlds, that takes the logic from game worlds and place it into physical spaces. So these are a series of installations that we did at the Victoria and Albert Museum recently, kind of taking some of the tropes that video game players might be kind of very used to in terms of their spatial experience and taking them into a gallery context. The V&A is really interesting in this regard because it was in the medieval galleries where they've basically taken fragments of historic buildings from around the world and sort of placed them into one environment, which is maybe the sort of artistic license that a lot of video game worlds also kind of play with. So one of the other things that kind of underpins my own research, but our research in our teaching, is the idea of video game urbanism. So how can games be used as a tool to engage people with design processes in relation to cities? And this kind of came out of a project that Sandra and I did together called, the video's going a bit funny, but called Tokyo Backup City, which was inspired by a real plan from a Japanese politician to create an entire backup Tokyo that would kind of be a life support system in the event that Tokyo was destroyed by a natural disaster. And so we ended up thinking about how we might kind of gamify this urban realm. The project itself that was actually proposed was quite a banal kind of like business park type model, and we wondered whether we could kind of use the sort of mania that one experiences walking around kind of like Shibuya or Kabukicho in Tokyo and actually kind of reframe a new city around those ideas. And this also comes into some of my other projects. Again, this video is playing a bit funny, but using, this is a game called Drawing Hunter, where the player kind of has to hunt errors or glitches in an architectural system. So you have your little kind of drawing gun, and you jump on revision clouds, which is what architects use to kind of indicate changes in their drawings. So all the videos are a bit sped up, so it might be a little bit unclear to watch. But what was kind of find interesting is being able to switch very quickly within the game engine software to different views, different ways of looking at things. So to sort of flick between the view of the person in an architectural space through to the architectural elevation, through to an isometric, to be able to kind of see this constantly updating architecture. So in this case, the system for distributing all of these sort of architectural elements is a kind of algorithm which makes certain decisions, and as the player runs through the game, they need to kind of, sometimes it fails, but they need to kind of integrate these sort of systems of distribution into the way that they experience the world. And so this is kind of, this is our master's research cluster show, which was in September, where we kind of made a sort of arcade of all of these various games. So you can see like architectural drawings, but then the games become a kind of crucial platform for engaging people with cities. And I think that maybe there's different ways in which we can do this. So to think about London, for instance, the economy of London and the amount of new developments we see in London is kind of a pressing political question that perhaps games can start to talk about. This is a game by an artist called Paolo Pedicini, who does a lot of kind of political video games. And this is basically a game called Nova Alea, which is about the housing bubble and property prices in the city. And so by playing the game, you kind of learn a bit about the notion of what a kind of property bubble is. So it's quite instructional and political in the way that you actually play the game. And similarly, I became really interested in this video that was made by a developer of a London luxury residential development, which kind of returned to sort of 1980s Gordon Gekko type aesthetics and reframed architecture as something that was a prize to be won by the person that kind of overcomes all obstacles in the city. And of course, if you look around London now, you see hoardings for all these new developments, and each one has these kind of language of hubris. It's the greatest release in history. And so each building seems to have its own kind of cheesy slogan that underpins it. And so I basically researched a number of what are the buildings going up in London, what are buildings that are proposed, what are the different kinds of facilities that these buildings have, and what kind of lifestyle do they engender, and turn them into a series of kind of units to be placed within a game space. So in this case, I used voxels, so it kind of looks like Minecraft. And I think what's interesting about that is the voxel it makes everything look kind of childlike. So in a sense, you can take advantage of the game as a sort of a tool of liberation, that many people could kind of play it on different levels and understand the critique within it. So for instance, some of these things are like related to like air purification of which there was a really interesting article about residential towers in China, which had kind of amazing air quality, and how that was being brought into towers in London as well. And then on the other hand, you've got a bust of Margaret Thatcher, maybe a kind of symbolic of returning to this 1980s style hubris. So these became a kind of world of these architectural structures that would be located within my game. How can I play this? It doesn't have a mouse, this one, that's the problem. Okay, so there was a game that I created that basically would involve the design of these skyscrapers, and as the player plays through it, they have to do things like transcribe a kind of architect's napkin sketch. So these kind of moments of inspiration that we see behind these buildings in a kind of cheesy way, the player would sort of be enacting the process of these buildings being procured and then built, and in the end they'd be able to construct their own kind of glossy advertisements from that. But we can also think about how games might be used to tackle the landscapes through which our cities are surrounded by and our cities engage with. So this was a master's project from last year, which was looking at the history of Los Angeles. And for instance, you might be aware of Los Angeles' famous river, which is this big kind of concrete storm drain, and how there's actually kind of initiatives underway to sort of re-greenify that because it's quite an inhospitable area. So these students looked at the history of Los Angeles and its kind of development, how the landscape was obviously tied to, for instance, the oil industry. And so the player essentially plays through history in quite a kind of cheeky manner with 3 different tools, one for making greenery, one for kind of constructing buildings, and one for pumping investment into things. And over time, they can kind of shape their own version of Los Angeles. So although the game mechanics are quite kind of abstract, the game starts to speak to people about what the actual history of Los Angeles was and how it grew as a city. And then this is another game of a Los Angeles suburbia, where there's a series of houses that the player kind of engages with, each of which tests a new mode of living. So, for instance, there's a history in Los Angeles of people having sold the mining rights under their houses to oil companies to be able to drill for oil. So this idea of kind of, I guess, domestic space being tied into economy and how that might work, these students proposed a series of these houses. Again, it's a bit hard to see because it's kind of jerking around, but as you walk around this suburbia, there's a series of kind of case study houses, which is a reference to a series of famous architectural projects cited in Los Angeles, which were kind of tests of new ways of living, where the house kind of grows around different kind of logics. So in this case, you've got a profitable house where the house ends up growing to create advertisement structures. It becomes an oil refinery, and then ultimately it becomes a kind of Airbnb sort of hotel at the same time. And then I'm kind of also interested in how sites and environments might start to become kind of internalized as well. So this is from my doctoral work, and I thought because my doctorate's about video game spaces, that I'd actually make the whole structure of my doctorate as a video game space itself. So in a sense, these are all hand-drawn elements that the player's walking through, but it's basically the whole structure of my doctoral thesis becomes an actual video game space. So you're essentially walking from chapter to chapter of my thesis as an architectural space. So you can see there's the reference to the London game that I was just showing. But then there's the question of legality in the city as well. So this was another game from last year called the Snooper's Charter, which looks at surveillance in London. And essentially the player kind of plays this sort of anarchist kind of disruptive influence who is trying to fight against surveillance technologies within London. So they proposed a sort of open world video game space that each kind of sector or each task that the player has to undergo is related to pieces of research that they've investigated about surveillance technologies and how they're obviously mediating the way that our cities are designed, the way that our cities are experienced, and eventually the idea is that the player would kind of hopefully start to disrupt all of these things. And then it also comes into the way that maybe the design of the built environment is communicated to people. So I don't know if you're aware, but if building's about to be built in the UK, you have these planning notices which are attached to lampposts and things like that, and they basically give members of the public information about what building is going to be built on the site that you might see behind it. But they're quite sad in a way because they're kind of like a laminated sheet of A4 and there's not really much fun about it. And also, you have to look very closely to understand the information. And sometimes the information is also quite loose in what it actually defines. So this is a game called the Playable Planning Notice, which was basically thinking, how can we reinvent the planning notice as a video game space? And how can we address the fact that sometimes these notices actually don't necessarily give you that much information up front? So in the game, there's a series of scenarios which are drawn from real planning notices that they kind of recorded around Bloomsbury. For instance, one says like various works to various trees. Now that's quite interesting because there's so much kind of subjective latitude as to what that might mean. And it starts to open up questions about how is the design of the built environment communicated to people. So in this game, the player, for instance, can start to perform various works to various trees, and then the game, they can kind of judge the success of their constructions against those parameters. So in this case, it's the erection of a mansard roof. So in some ways, the player needs to have a knowledge of like what a mansard roof actually is, but there's a kind of, there's varying levels of kind of subjectivity that can be built into this. And in the end, they imagined that the planning notice might become a kind of augmented reality device that actually you could start to see all the different various outputs of what people have created within this game that would be tied to the real planning proposal. But we can also start to think about identity as well. So just as an example, this is a game called Sir, You're Being Hunted by Big Robot, which came out about 3 years ago. And in the game, you're being hunted by these kind of English gentleman robots. But what's really interesting is that, again, they use like algorithmic kind of design to make what's called a procedurally generated world. So the world is kind of generated by an algorithm. But there's a series of kind of elements that are dispersed using that algorithm. And they call this the British countryside generator, which I think is really interesting because, for instance, this British countryside generator is responsible for dispersing hedgerows and fields and little hamlets, which all have randomly generated kind of appropriate small little village names. And it kind of gets me to thinking, like, how does something like this tie into identity? Because obviously in the UK, we're kind of dealing with our own identity quite a lot at the moment. And somehow you could imagine something like this being kind of co-opted by like Nigel Farage to make this kind of parochial vision of the UK that could extend on forever. You know, what do you include in your fantasy of what the UK is? And could you build a system that could generate, infinite possible versions of that UK? And so in the end, it kind of creates this game world. But I think what's more interesting is all the constituent parts and what their role is in kind of creating this version of the English country landscape. So we also had another student project, which was probably one of the most kind of overtly political ones, which is called E-London, which is a slightly surreal tale of life post-Brexit, which has a sort of, I don't know if any of you have seen the film They Live, where the protagonist puts on these sunglasses and starts to see the truth of the matter. But the game was basically, their idea was that maybe, given that London was so kind of against the idea of Brexit compared to other parts of the country, that Londoners could use augmented reality systems to kind of opt into the European Union. And what would that mean for our lives if you could put these augmented reality glasses on and start to get connections to like the health services in Europe and the kind of research that might be, kind of not so well funded after we leave the EU. And so although the game's kind of quite surreal, here's UCL, and I think this is attending a lecture from ETH at the same time, but when you take off your glasses, we're back to UCL. So it's kind of quite surreal, but some of the points are really serious because it does talk about how collaboration, how science and education is going to change when we leave the EU, and are there any mechanisms that we could use to kind of make sure that we retain our links. And the game, I think what's important here is that the game allows you to kind of live and experience that. So although it's done in quite a surreal way, you actually have to, maneuver through these spaces and engage with these objects and kind of understand the feedback that this system gives you in terms of all these different tasks you have to undergo in your daily existence to sort of mediate between these two worlds. So this is a shot from the latest Mario Odyssey game. I think it's the Luncheon Kingdom. So I guess to conclude, what I find really interesting about games as a medium is that, as I mentioned before, they allow us to connect like the visual world of architectural representation to systems. So in this case, the students previously, they could have just drawn this world of e-London, of this potentially augmented reality post-Brexit London condition, but instead the medium of the game allows them to kind of demonstrate things through the actions that people are allowed to perform within that game world. And I think that's going to continue to hopefully propagate in architectural design, that we can start to investigate the way that our actual behavior is kind of mediated through using games because they're an interactive and immersive technology. I also think that there's an interesting question that I haven't really raised here, but also the new generations of students that we get who have grown up with video games being a completely culturally accepted medium, which is not necessarily the case when I was growing up, where I would have been a little bit of a geek. But I think that's also going to change our sort of spatial and aesthetic expectations of the world. So I guess to conclude, I would say that architects should certainly be making video game worlds, but they also already are.
Thank you very much, Luke. A lot of information there, a lot of food for thought. As is customary, we have time for some questions. We have microphones in the back, so we can take a few questions if you care to put your hand up and make yourself known. Gentleman over here.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have some interest in that. I have some training as an architect, and I have been playing video games, and I have been combining the two in almost designing video games. And I've seen there's a big difference between architects and game developers in terms of what they look for in the space they design. So architecture generally designs a space to be lived in, whereas games usually design a world that is a spectacle first and foremost, and then an environment to interact with. So do these two views reconcile somehow, or is there any? Do you have any particular thoughts on this?
I mean, I think for this talk, I kind of sidestepped that a little bit by maybe emphasizing the speculative architecture at the start, which is, I think games are probably predisposed very well to thinking about, the way we behave in a wider kind of realm. So to tie into architecture as like as a theoretical practice as much as it is a kind of, the minutiae of the design. But I think that's kind of interesting because there is also this question of interface, right? And how do you connect someone to architectural space in a video game through, it has to be through an interface which then imposes its own logics on top of things. So I think it's kind of, it's an interesting question which I don't necessarily have a complete answer for, because I think the scale that we're working at the moment is looking at cities and behaviors and systems. And I think that's where the game medium is like really good for investigating those things. But I also understand when you go down into like the level of domestic space and experiencing space in a way, that there are very different kind of values in play. And I think generally, in some ways, that's why I think it will be really fascinating as architects continue to engage with game technologies more and more, because they will bring a different sensibility and a different way of approaching things. Because I think the other thing to say, which I was discussing with someone the other day, is how many video game worlds are like really referential of architectural worlds. And that's really fascinating because it obviously engages people with architecture in new ways, but there's also the question of what happens if we make, or what happens if architects learn from video game aesthetics in terms of their worlds, or what happens if we use video game worlds that aren't about referencing like well-known tropes of like historical architecture or certain architectural styles. I think they're really kind of open questions, but they're really interesting because I think as architects increasingly become engaged with this software, as I say, I think they will hopefully bring more conversations to the table. But I think first and foremost, they're also entertainment media, which means their properties are slightly different to some of the properties we might be chasing in the Bartlett, for instance.
The gentleman there, and then.
Sure. Well, thank you for your talk. I loved the theme overall because I've been very interested in this for a few years because I'm part of that generation that grew up playing games. And for me, what I've always found very interesting about the prospect of architecture in games is that when you get immersed in a gaming experience, you get in touch with a different world, with a different way of thinking, with a different approach to things. And what I sort of been developing as an idea is this thought that my background is in coaching. So I thought, how can I take my background in coaching and create a fantasy world such that as people interact with this in a video game form, they actually learn these concepts in the game, and then in real life they can actually use this for themselves. So what I'm curious about is from from I suppose from a holistic perspective, but also architecture, because architecture is very much one of the things that gets these things across. How can what is the role in architecture in being able to design experiences that not only reflect on the world at large, but really create a learning experience that people can take with them back into their lives and into the real world?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Oh, had to go.
I mean, I think that obviously that learning experience is always mediated by the game as well. And unfortunately, the video wasn't working. But one of my own projects is, I guess, not necessarily trying to train someone as an architect, but to try and kind of reveal the sort of processes that people might find quite opaque in architecture being like commissioned and built in the UK, and like why are these buildings being built? These buildings that only seem to serve certain types of economic interests that aren't for everyone. And to use the game as a kind of mechanism to sort of, I guess, elucidate the trail of how those things come into being. And in that way, I think there's lots of potential, like with the planning game, for not necessarily like training or coaching someone for a specific thing, because, you know, if you're a planning officer, you're not going to be building these things out of little blocks, but to maybe like kind of intellectually start to create arguments through the game that can like give people new knowledge about how our cities are built and how architectural processes take place, because I think that's quite important. And games as like a sort of public-facing medium have a kind of potentially have a prerogative to start to be engaging with those kind of things. So I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, just in terms of like coaching as such, but in terms of I think using the game mechanism to kind of reinforce certain things is potentially really interesting. Although it always reminds me, I can't remember which book it was I was reading, but I think one of Paolo Pedicini's other games was a sort of simulation of running McDonald's. And so the game was designed to be a kind of political commentary on, like, you know, you can have badly farmed beef, but it's cheap, or you can have, well looked after cows, but it's more expensive, and to sort of build your value system through that. And in this book, it was saying that in the end, all these kind of message boards popped up with people trying to ask each other, how do I win this game? And the way to win the game was to be like the most profitable McDonald's, was to be the worst person you could possibly be. But people were interested in playing the game as a game. And so that, I think that's another big conversation. But how do you allow people to engage not only with the gameness of the game, but the content of the game as well? And because I know, like, when you become really kind of invested in certain types of game, it's like the systems you're playing as much as it is the content of that game.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we can only take one more question, so last question.
Thank you so much. My question has got more to do about the mediums of the whole. So, speculation and architecture involve, say, necessitate a lateral thinking process, and computation is grounded within the binary. I mean, the binary thinking process. So, I was really curious to know, how do you think that space of negotiation between the two change the medium? I mean, like the speculations are informing the binary nature of computation and vice versa. And you've been doing both, so I was just.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I come from the architecture background of making things by hand. So I think the interplay between the logical systems and the kind of the presentation of the game is really interesting. And I think architects do maybe come at things from a different angle, as in like I have an imagination of what a particular spatial condition might be. What is the kind of underpinnings of the world that I'd need to make in order to facilitate that? That's not necessarily completely different to how a game designer would approach things, I guess. But I think that also this kind of idea of, for instance, the creativity of like emergent systems and being able to make an algorithm that you don't necessarily, you know that it has certain properties and it will behave in certain ways, but the player then has a kind of role in that can start to kind of articulate the space in a new way through their actions. I think that to me is also really interesting because, for instance, the game that I was showing, the Drawing Hunter one, I put the pieces in play, but then there's a system that starts to regulate that and the player can start to manipulate it. But the sort of raw architectural components, the sort of, the built matter of it is kind of dictated by me in a way. And so I think that kind of interplay, probably not answering the question particularly perfectly, but I think that there's different kind of cultures, because I know there'll be people that can talk about this from the coding side with a much kind of stronger basis, and to them, I think to say that coding is super creative act in itself as well, and the kind of construction and synthesis of behaviors and language in code is in itself a really creative process. So I think for me the interest is really in how those two things can combine. So I think ultimately it comes down to for me, as I discussed, this kind of relationship between the worlds that we might imagine and then being able to structure the behaviors that we might imagine within those worlds as well. And I think they're two sides of the same coin.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to say thank you to Luke. I think it came over well. Very good questions there. It's really important. I think that that you are doing this work, testing out this new possibility. There is a generational change going on. Architects and other designers have always been looking for different forms of tools to explore their ideas. Let's not forget that for a very long time, architects have been designing, and other people have been designing cities as ways of exploring ideas. And so you can see a very strong historical continuity in some ways, but also this new idea of experimenting with new possibilities, multiplayer games, etc. And I think it's really important that this work has been tackled here. And I just say also, and final thing is that architects are often accused of editing out human emotions when they come to thinking about their projects and how they do, etc. And I thought it was very, very strong. I would say the role even of humour in Luke's work, etc. There's a sort of richness, there's an enjoyment, a pleasure, which again might be a beneficial thing for many of our buildings in our cities as well. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.